Does it make sense to put a 2002 Tokina film lens on a digital camera? Well, it definitely would have made sense to thoroughly clean your stuff before you photograph it. But now it's too late. I filmed this video in English because I guess it's only of use for a very, very limited number of people. Nevertheless, it contains information I would have found useful before embarking on this little adventure. So, why on earth would you like to put a super zoom lens from the film era in front of a modern digital camera? Firstly, because you can. And secondly, I use my Canon EOS M50 as a hybrid camera and only own the kit lens. For telephoto, I use a 10-year-old Nikon L830 compact super zoom. At the long end, at 765mm equivalent, performance has always been very questionable, but recently it also showed funky behavior at more conservative focal length. So, what if I use my old Tokina 24-200 on the Canon? The EOS M50 has a crop factor of 1.6. This gives me a 38 to 320mm equivalent, a rather funky range, but I mainly want to use it on the long end, where my kit lens maxes out at 72 mils. So how can I achieve this, and what will be the performance? Basically, I have two options. First, I buy a used Sony A-mount DSLR, which is the same as the old Minolta A-mount, my Minolta Dynex 404 SI film camera from 1999 uses. A quick check shows that prices start at around €100 for APS-C cameras or €500 for full frames. The full frame option would be intriguing because there the 24 to 200mm lens makes a lot of sense. On the APS-C sensor, the zoom range is much less compelling, and realistically, I don't want to lug around another camera. But what if the lens doesn't perform on a digital camera? Second option is to buy an adapter from Minolta A-mount on a Canon EF M mount. Pholsy sells those on Amazon for around €40. With this adapter, you can fit an A-mount lens on a Canon EF M camera. It has no electronic connections, so it's a completely manual experience. You have to manually focus the lens, and you have to dial in the correct shutter speed and watch what the ISO is doing if you're an auto ISO. Since my Tokina lenses have no aperture ring, the lens always shoots wide open. This is a less than ideal situation, as you usually have to stop down super zooms at least 2 stops to deliver acceptable performance. So what to expect? There are, of course, no technical reviews for a 23-year-old lens, but on DxOMark I found a review for a Tamron super zoom lens on Sony DSLRs. So I switched to the Sony SLT Alpha 77, which also has a 24 megapixel APS-C sensor, like my Canon EOS M50. The sharpness chart shows a lot of red on the wide and much more so on the long end. The sharpness score is 9 megapixel, but this is measured over all aperture ranges and focal length. At least distortion, vignetting, and chromatic aberration is not a big deal. So I invested the €37 for the Pholsy adapter, and now it's time to find out how this combo works in the real world. This is the view from a kitchen window at 24mm or 38mm full frame equivalent. It was a 30-second edit in On1 Photo Raw, the photo editor I use after giving up Lightroom. And this is the original RAW file, where Earphone View, an image viewer, gives the best representation of the embedded JPEG. This is the comparison between the Tokina and the Canon lens at 38mm at full screen viewing size at my 27-inch monitor. Not much difference. The Canon is, even at this size, a bit sharper, as you would expect from a modern lens. This gets a bit more pronounced when you view it at 100%. Another weakness of the Tokina is the poor handling of highlights, as you can see on the second car at the bottom. When you really start pixel peeping at 200%, the softness of the Tokina becomes even more apparent. But all in all, not a bad performance for a lens from 2002. And you have to take into account that the Tokina was shot at f3.5, whereas the Canon program mode shows f11. You may say that this is not quite fair, but I wanted to test real-life performance and not make a technical comparison. On the Canon lens, all f-stops are accessible, whereas on the Tokina, I can only shoot wide open. The next example is 45mm or 72mm, 35mm equivalent, where the Canon lens maxes out. This again is the out-of-camera RAW, and this is the comparison at normal viewing angle. Again, the Tokina is a tad softer. This is the 100% comparison, and again you notice the weak highlights of the Tokina. And finally the 200% view, where the softness really becomes apparent. It almost looks a bit like the focusing was a bit off, but this shouldn't be the case. When manually focusing, I always use focus peaking, because solely relying on the viewfinder often doesn't give tech-sharp images. But even focus peaking can be off, as you can see in this image. Focus peaking lighted up like a Christmas tree, but nothing is sharp. So you also have to keep an eye on the distance scale, double-checking if the result is plausible. And finally, the Tokina at 200mm or 320mm full-frame equivalent. Here things start to get soft, even at normal viewing angle. This is the out-of-camera RAW, and this is the comparison to the Nikon L830, my 16-megapixel compact super zoom from 2014. The Nikon is sharper, but the Tokina shows more details, as you can see in the roof tiles. But I'm not sure if, all in all, I don't prefer the sharper Nikon. At 100%, the heavy processing of the Nikon JPEG becomes apparent, as the cheap super zoom doesn't shoot RAW. But again, more detail is visible at the somewhat blurry Tokina. At 200%, things get really bad. The heavily processed Nikon and the blurry Tokina. And is it color fringing on the sign at the right corner? The yellow stuff? And finally, the Nikon at 765mm equivalent. Here you clearly see the heavy processing and the lack of detail. But at 100%, you can see what the 450-meter distance sign is about. Eggs from free-roaming chicken sold around the clock.